have you ever, I guess you could speak personally if you want, or just a little more abstractly, like, is there an issue of like putting something out there that's too personal, or that you created in the moment, and then later on you thought, well, I don't know if I want that out on the internet, published somewhere. Just speaking from like a piece of personal writing that you might have done, or any kind of thought on that. Because I mean, there's you know publishing people's work, you see really personal stuff, and then obviously it's such a it's a joy to be able to share it. um but it takes some level of like, I don't know exactly what to call it, but like just some fortitude to say, yeah, this is how I expressed that thought and that experience at that time, and that's what it was.
Well, I can speak to that because I think you would know this best, Aaron, because you've seen a lot more of my work than the other two people here. But I've published two poems in Wild Roof in two separate issues, but those are outliers when it comes to my body of work. Typically, I don't write towards the aesthetic that we see in Wild Roof. I tend to be, I think, what did someone call it? I had a reader for my chapbook workshop, and they said it was like reading emotional acupuncture. Because I believe in the tenet that I think Natalie Goldberg states, where she says you have to go for the jugular. You have to tell the truth. You have to tell your truth. And the more true you are, no matter how you find a way to be truthful and authentic, that's where your poem connects with people. And I think especially poetry, fiction writing too, but especially poetry exists in this place where you're not exactly always telling a story, right? There are narrative poems, but what you're doing is speaking to essential human truths. Like, what are those human truths that are going to connect with people? And I have published poems that are about abuse, that are about assault, and they're out there in the world. And I used to have trouble with that. I used to worry, like, what if my mother reads this and she gets all sad or something? And then, my mother did read it and she liked it. And even if she didn't, that's my art. I found a way to funnel it into art. And when I was younger, I struggled a lot with my mental health. I had a lot of problems with anger. I had a lot of problems with depression and anxiety. And when I funneled that into writing, things changed for me. So I think, everybody has a different approach to this, and there's nothing wrong with being private. But I think as truthful as you want to be in your art, fuck it, you should do it. You should tell the truth at all times. I think one of the reasons that we have art in the world is the pursuit of truth, right? There's a reason that art booms during times of like societal upheaval. There's a reason that we need art when things are hard. And it's because there are those essential, universal human truths, and we all connect to each other. So, and I've said this before, you have to filter it through craft. You have to make sure that what you're writing down or what you're creating or what you're painting still has its element of craft. Otherwise, it's just a journal. You're just journaling. And there's something to be said for journaling. And I think it's very, very healthy. And that's a whole different rant that I have. And I think everybody should be journaling. But yeah, I mean, as long as you're using your elements of craft and you're approaching it as a piece of art, because a lot of my poetry is, not all of it. These days, I'm more writing in a more positive vein and about different experiences, but I've written a lot about trauma. So, yeah, I think people shouldn't have any shame. I think if people shame you for writing about whatever you feel is your truth, then they're not real readers.
Yeah.
And look at Sylvia Plath and Sexton.
I think she's come up once or twice on the podcast.
I'll always bring up Plath. I'll always bring her up.
If I remember correctly. But yeah, thanks for that response. I think that's kind of like tuning into exactly what I'm kind of like talking about, is like, yeah, and I mean, I live in that world where you see something that's put out in a creative manner, and like you said, that it is put out as, on one hand, a personal artifact, and on the other side of the coin is an aesthetic, piece. So even though it is personal, it is something that's separate from the person at the time. So there's that kind of just difficulty of like, if from the writer's perspective, like, do I want this thing out there? Because not everybody who sees it is going to have that have that ability to like make that distinction. They might have, more of a negative approach to it. But yeah, I think I mean, I'm obviously from a place where like we're approaching these things from that aesthetic perspective and making that distinction. So I think that's an important point to make.
I just finished teaching a course for women on self-discovery and writing, and it was a month-long course. And one of the most difficult aspects for some of the women were being vulnerable enough to tell their story. And so we created a safe place, and that's not always true out in the world that there's a safe place, but it's a great place to start. And then something that worked for some of them was instead of using I, they would write in third person to tell their poems or their stories. And then they always had the chance later, if it felt like it needed to be in the first person, they could always move it back, but it gave them an opportunity. And I really appreciated watching that experience happen, to take the different lens and move it around so that it could be shared, and then they could make discernment around it.
I say that I love that idea, because I think I grew up with almost too much of the idea that someday I'll be a writer, so all my meaningful experiences will show up in writing. And so, out on a date or climbing a mountain or, doing changing a tire on the side of the road in the rain, and like, think of how good this will sound in writing. And then I would stifle myself up by trying to do the journaling and try to narrative flow and what the voice is going to sound like. And I have had a few experiences just accidentally where if I turned it third person, okay. For the experience, third person is a safety mode that get a little distance. But then I figured out if I crafted a first person voice that was in an unrealistic situation, the first person voice. So they're kind of two tracks again going on at the same time. So the fantasy for me, I'm more interested ultimately in longer narrative forms. The pile of half a novel is over there in the corner, would be to have the kind of essential honesty over here, but also with the first person voice that is kind of plucky and funny, and it's a narrator that's mostly me that I relate to. And if I could bring those two together, that would be the fantasy for any bigger projects.
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, I have a short story that I'm shopping right now, Chris, that's about strippers and cocaine. And it's not for every journal.
Did you take that from my journle?
I should send it to you. It's only 3 pages long. It's a little flash fiction. Oh man, I'm really proud of that little piece, but I can tell, I submit it out and I have to research each journal to be like, do you want this? Because you have to teach people to read your work, and everybody has their unique voice. And there's a lot of discussion about finding your voice. And I think the more authentic you are and the more you tell your truth, whether or not it's painful, or sometimes, there are poets that tell their truth. I mean, there's the poet that I talked about on the last podcast. He's a, ex punk and hardcore member of punk and hardcore touring band and everything. And I think he calls himself a failed rock star. And so his truth isn't necessarily always sad, right? But it's his truth. And I mean, like Ada Limon, who's, one of where I think we're living in the age of Ada right now. She's magical. A lot of her truth is sensual, and it's cutting in its own way, but it's also gleeful. The way that she approaches life is with a lot of appreciation for what she has and what's around her. She has this great poem where she writes about her parents being divorced and how she had abundance. She had 2 households of love, and it wasn't that she came from a broken home. She came from a more whole home because she had more. She had more. She characterized it as abundance. So yes, I mean, you don't necessarily have to be writing about sad to be authentic, but I think you have to incorporate some of your own self into it. And I think as long as you're authentic, you connect. That's like the biggest advice I give people, is just tell the truth.
Right. And not all poetry is biographical. And yet our experience is all we have. So even in fiction, I always think that writer puts so much of their experience in it because we can't help it.
Yeah.
We're narcissistic beings. We have to come from where we are, and we read from where we are. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of subject matter I'm never going to write about because of my life history and because
You
of my
couldn't.
life experience.
Right, same,
wouldn't
I
have
couldn't.
it. Yeah, I
Mhm.
don't have it. I can't write about New England. I'm not from there.
Right.
Like,
Right.
I can't write about I can't do a Robert Frost and talk about the fence posts in New England and the long walk I took in the snow because I don't know what we're talking about. I don't have snow. I live in the desert. Like, that's all I got. I got like desert white trash and strippers and cocaine and like those sorts of things around me. And that's the kind of stuff that I like to write about. So yeah, I think wherever you find your joy in writing, you should write it. And you should also create art even if you aren't going to show it to anyone. I'm far
That's a
too
great
open.
discussion right there, Erin. That's a great question, right?
You should create art just for yourself. I mean, ultimately everything I write is just for me. And as long as I'm happy, that's all that matters. You know, not all of it I think is good enough to submit to lit journals. And if
But
you
should
find
you
my
have not
social
written
media,
it?
like it's still, I post the ones that I think aren't good enough for submission onto my social media, which, you know, in retrospect, maybe is a bad practice if I want to be taken seriously as an artist, but I don't care because I wrote them and I think they're funny. And sometimes
Mhm.
poetry is how I communicate with the world. Like that's just how I experience the world as I think about it through
Yeah.
poetics, to what you're saying, Chris, right? Some of my life experiences, I'll just be like, well, this is a whole ass poem when I'm changing a tire or something. It's like, this is a unique situation and I like it. And I like the way that I look at things, the way that I think that like this could be art every moment of my
Because
life.
you're reaffirming it, right? You're kind of reinforcing it as it's happening, creating your own mythology. Have you ever run into the problem that I have where you have an anecdote that's obviously a good anecdote, but it doesn't necessarily match the mythology? So strippers and cocaine, like I have a chapter that I'm trying to write right now, which is about two characters, fictional, who spend the night in the attic of a strip club because the guy knew the guy who owned the strip club. And we were able to kind of camp out. And if you want to know what an attic of a strip club looks like, it looks like a normal attic because there's like Halloween decorations, Halloween outfits, and the stuff the girls have, and the house mom has her stuff over here. And so we're basically spending the evening in the attic of the strip club. They lock the doors and we deliberately sneak up there. And it's like a great anecdote, but I don't know how to write it because it's fun to tell the story, but like, what's the moral going to be exactly? Like, and we stuck out in the morning and they never knew. That's a good story to tell, but the spiritual undertone of that, I can't quite latch onto it.
But
you
maybe
could
as
always
you're
take-
writing it, it might come because it's
That's
a
the-
very interesting story. I'm engaged. Maybe it will come.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, there's always, and you could always take the, what is it? Is it postmodern where there is no moral, right? There doesn't
No, I
need
want
to
there
be
to
a
be moral.
moral to your
I need a
story.
moral.
You're
You need a
amoral.
moral. You need a moral. I'm not
I'm
sure.
very pro-moral.
I'm literally gonna.
I like a lot of postmodern theory in some frames if you're analyzing other people, but you know, just in terms of writing, when I felt best about writing, it was both personal narrative. It's something that either was related to me or something that I believe in, and it reaffirmed it. It made it more real, and it kind of created or contributed to kind of that personal mythology. And when other people respond to that, they're like, "Oh, I also had a situation like that, different circumstances, but it related to the essence."
Maybe
I
not
guess
the
it's
attic of the stripper club, maybe the back room, maybe, I don't know.
Well, I mean, I want to stay true to the experience. It was the attic when we actually
That's
did this.
great.
Well, what intrigues me about that is the idea that it's like a normal attic, right? It's just like Halloween decorations and the
That's
house
the
mom
thing.
stuff, which
There's
could
a
be
big
anybody's
Santa
mom's
over here.
stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like just a vanity and like the Halloween decorations and like that's kind of like I don't know. I mean, it could be a setting for anything. It doesn't even need to be the attic of a strip club, right? Just any sort of. And I think what's funny about it and what's interesting about it is that you expect it to be anything but mundane when you go up there. You're
Well,
like,
that's
this is
what I
gonna
was
be,
just gonna
there's
say.
gonna be
I wanna
thongs
keep-
and glitter everywhere and drugs.
I want to keep it in the attic of the strip club is because that's where I actually experienced that. So like changing the tire in the rain, I actually spent that evening up there and there was the weird smells and there was like the Christmas stuff over here, but there's also the weird high heels over here. And we're just kind of rummaging. It's me and another guy just rummaging through what looks to be kind of a normal attic. But since that really happened, I guess the way I want to write it is he and I have a more philosophical conversation about it while it's happening. I guess that would be the fantasy.
Yeah.
Well, yeah,
The
that's
two of us
that was
talk
just
through it more intelligently. At the time, we're like, oh, let's put the Santa hats on.
yeah, I think that's what was coming to mind. It was like that conversation is kind of like on the nature of like fantasy and reality and like, you know, like the expectation versus the actual experience.
And what is a strip club if not a semaphore or a facsimile of what you want to be a real experience? Okay, I got it. Thank you.
Where does that come up in
Here's
your
the-
novel, right? In other places, there's your mythology, right? When is the normal and sort of the abnormal coming up against each other? And I use that abnormal loosely, but you know.
Yeah. Well, it's like, is
Kind of the
this,
stipulation
was
versus
this,
the reality? We know there's an exploitation factor happening, but
There's
that's
a lot
also
in it.
yeah. But like, I'm imagining, like, you could even, if this is fictional, go for it, but like, everybody else is like downstairs, like having like the experience of like the good time in quotes. And you and the other the other character are like in the attic, like rummaging and like engaging with like this more real.
We were downstairs initially, and we kind of like had a
Yeah.
halfway deal with the half owner to sneak upstairs. So I
Yeah,
can't
so it's
take
like,
credit
it's
for
this
sneaking
kind
up
of
there
like
on our own.
separation aspect of like, you're separating yourselves from the masses.
Gotcha. Yeah,
Yeah.
we had a little trouble getting out in the morning. I actually did struggle with that.
I can imagine.
I almost think that's a great
fun.
opening line. We had a little trouble getting out in the morning.
That is a good line.
I know you missed our opening line workshop, but you made up for it.
I'm obsessive
Oh.
about opening lines, man. Opening lines and final lines, like that's what I look for as a reader of any poem. That's the first
Yeah.
thing I'm gonna look at. And I filter like through that. I'm like, how did we start? Did we start with a bang? And how did we end? Because I want to know
Yeah.
where you're bringing me. What's our natural conclusion that you're bringing me to? And I think it's really hard to end any piece of writing. That used to be my big problem when I first started writing. I was like 19 years old, and I had a family friend that was sort of a mentor to me. He was a creative writing professor, and I could start stories, but I couldn't finish them because I didn't know what I wanted to talk about. And I think that's where you start out with writing, because you don't know, to Chris's point, what's the moral of your story? What are you trying to say here? And I think with poems, much like songs, right? The songs have like the chorus. Poems have like their closing line, which is like, this is our thesis. This is what I'm trying to say to you. Like, I think I'm thinking of Ada Limon again, only because it's the first, this one poem, I think it's called The End of Poetry or The Death of Poetry. It closes her most recent book. It ends with, I am asking you to touch me. And I think it's a real banger to like end a whole book on, but also to end a poem on. And it's so direct.
Great line.
Oh, it is a great line. I think about that line all the time, and I think she's read it for like the Library of Congress now. It's because she's the new U.S. Poet Laureate. But killer line. And so that's, I look for that all the time. But opening lines, I think if you can really punch someone in the gut, then you hook them and they don't leave you. And like with those stick egg poems, like the one I was talking about today, Grandfather Passes in the Hall, it's like, it starts off with a bang, right? And he never lets up. He just like keeps hitting you with those gut punch sentences. And so you're hooked through this entire page long stanza. And it's masterful. It's really, really good.